Welcome to the Conservation and Development of State Heritage Assets workshop today. Thank you all for coming. My name is Alethea. I work at the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. Got my name badge, but got my lanyard. We've got 5 speakers today, and they will be talking about some different case studies, which hopefully will be helpful for you all in your agencies. Some wins and big projects, small projects. So hopefully you'll get something out of today and can take that back with you to your agency, and also make some connections if you needed to contact people, particularly the speakers, after. So we'll kick off with the first speaker. Oh, actually, we'll do an acknowledgement first. Sorry, Catherine, got too excited. So I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the country of the Noongar people and pay respect to their elders past, present and future. And now we'll start with Catherine. So Catherine is one of my colleagues at DPLH, and she's going to cover the guidelines for state government heritage property disposal process, and developing heritage places using some case studies.
Great, thanks Alethea. Let me know if you can't hear me. All right, so as Alethea said, the purpose of today's presentation is to give an overview of state agencies' responsibilities and sort of a way of managing and conserving their state heritage assets. We do have a guide, which is a helpful resource if you are managing state assets within your department, within your agency. We have a link that we can provide later on. So one of the things that we identified within the department was that there's sort of 4 steps that are really important for an agency to address when they're looking at their portfolio of heritage assets. One of the biggest ones that we see a lot of, and probably all of you can appreciate, is that actually identifying what you have is probably the first step and one of the most important steps. I know even within our department, we don't always know what we have, which can be a little bit of a problem. So we find that developing an inventory of your heritage assets, identify the assets that you own, and then map them against the listings, so the state or local heritage listings, is actually really important. The next one is thinking about planning. How do you manage that asset? Or as we joked in our strategic meeting we had last week within the department, unmanaged assets. Not managing assets. So planning for how you address that place. So forward planning is really important, or planning for disposal. So what asset do you have and how do you manage it? The next step is the use. So we often say within heritage circles, if you're not familiar, a place in use is a place conserved. If there's no use, if it's vacant, as we probably all know for dealing with some of these assets that are left vacant for long periods of time, they deteriorate at a much faster rate. They're also more prone to vandals, antisocial behaviour, and then we see things that get burnt down. So it's just not ideal for anyone. It's not a good look for government either. So often having a use or maintaining a use is quite critical to conserving that place. Step 4, outlined in our guides, is reviewing and adapting. So it's all well and good to put in place a plan. We need to reflect on that plan, because plans change, things change, government aims and goals change, or an agency's goals and aims change, or their use of what they require from an asset. This is an example of Department of Health. They undertook an inventory of their heritage assets. And this is just an example. It might be one that's useful for an agency to do. What the place is, what's its listing, whether it's state or local, just as important as each other. So you can kind of identify what assets do we have. Here's an example of forward planning. So I don't know if anyone's been to Fremantle recently. the old police station, well, former court and police station. Not useful for the Department of Justice, I think, to own anymore, not meeting their needs. So this one was disposed. But planning for that disposal is just as important. And then we see a really good heritage outcome, but also a great outcome for government. We don't have a vacant building that's a liability sitting there. We have one that's been disposed, moved out of government, and has a really great outcome for the community. Use. So this is a funny example, and I was a bit hesitant to use this one because it's a museum. So this new use was the #1 fire station on Murray Street. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that building. Beautiful building, state heritage listed. Obviously, DFES had no use for it anymore. So it was converted into a museum. Museums are slightly problematic when we talk about use, because you can't have 50 or 100 museums of every kind of purpose. But for this example, it was a great adaptive reuse for a building. And small interventions. So when we look at these types of buildings, we can allow for small interventions that change the way that that building functions to allow a new use. An important part of that review process, as I mentioned. So I ran through that quite quickly. There are guides on our website, and we can provide links if anyone's interested. So now I wanted to talk about, so after running through that guide really quickly, is probably why you're all here today, is talking about the development of heritage places as government agencies, and also what's required for disposing of state assets. We often get a lot of questions about both. We still have agencies that just aren't always 100% sure what their responsibilities are, what processes they need to follow. And it's something that we say, ask us early and ask us often, because we always try and help, but sometimes when we get things right at the last minute, it really pushes us. So developing heritage places, what's required? For this one, we get a lot of questions about what's required to be referred, what works, what exemptions exist. So what do you not need to refer to us? We get one, we had a call recently, it was quite funny. It was, we need to replace the nails in a deck. Which ones do you prefer? And we were like, I don't really mind. Don't really care, that's fine. We've got this heritage doorknob. Can we remove it to remove and repair it? Yes, that's fine, please do. So we get broad spectrum. We get ones where they go, do we need to refer it? And it's like, the works are about to start. Like, oh no. To the other extreme, do we care about nails? Probably not as much. So this is a big one, and something I personally, in my role, so I'm split across 2 teams currently, work in the development as well as a specialist team that can provide specialist advice to government. So what's required to be referred? And this is where we find people get tripped up a lot. So works that have a potential to impact on the heritage values of a state registered place under Section 73 of the Heritage Act are required to be referred for advice from the Heritage Council by a decision maker. So as part of a planning approval process, a development approval, local determining authorities, whoever that may be, WAPC, local government, are required to refer to the Heritage Council advice where it affects the state registered place. This is part of the approvals process, so it doesn't sit outside. We have 42 days under the Act, which is within that 60-day approval timeframe from a decision maker. What we do say is, if you're not sure, ask us. We can give preliminary advice that's non-statutory. So if you're not sure, always contact us. We're always more than happy to assist, rather than getting a surprise at the end when we go, we're not sure about that. Most referrals are dealt with under delegation. So we have delegates that have been delegated powers by the Heritage Council. Most of the delegations we deal with are minor or have a moderate impact. Larger ones are often referred to the Heritage Council. So something to factor in. One I've come across recently, which is why I've just sort of sneakily pushed into the presentation is that it's not just within the registered place. So depending on what mapping system you're using to determine if you have a mapping system, we have one internally, there's a registered curtilage of a place. We've had it recently that it's not just requiring, if there's works not just in that curtilage, sometimes works outside of that curtilage may impact on the heritage values. In that case, under Section 73, a referral is also required. So something to keep in mind. It's not just, oh, that's a heritage place, or we're working, you know, behind the fence, and that's fine. It still needs to be referred, because sometimes it does have an impact. So something to keep in mind. And again, if you're not sure, feel free to ask. We can tell you if a referral is required. The bit that's exciting, I'm sure, when we don't need a referral. So building maintenance, please maintain. That's usually what we say to people. We get queries a lot. Oh, I want to fix this door, or like this roof that's leaking. Do I need a referral? I'm just going to fix a tile. Please fix your roof. It's really important. So where maintenance doesn't remove or damage significant, or where new materials are used. Again, if you're not sure, please ask. Or repairs where they're like for like. So we often find people get tripped up with the like for like. Like for like doesn't mean a new material or a new technique. So for example, grout injection or structural repairs to cracking, that's not like for like. We need to make sure that the process that is used is not going to damage that heritage fabric. Repairs that are like for like are things like replacing damaged timber with a similar type of timber, that's like for like. Or where you have some loose roof tiles that may be damaged or cracked, replacing those with the same material, that's like for like. Or mortar repairs, so you might have damaged mortar. Mortar in most heritage buildings is sacrificial, so it will deteriorate over time. Where you're replacing with the same material that's being used, that would be like for like. And again, we can advise. If you're not sure, we can say, yes, that's like for like, you do not need a referral. And that advice, that email advice, can go to the decision maker too, so they know they don't need to refer them. Other examples of exemptions, cleaning, that should be a given. Hopefully most people realise that. Temporary signage is also one that is exempt under the Act and under the regulations. Temporary items, so security fencing, you need to put up something to like in a vacant place, let's secure it, put up some hoardings, that's fine. So what about developing places? So you've got past the point, you go, yes, I need a referral. What can we do with this place? So how we, as a department, how the Heritage Council assess these developments is we use what's called the Borough Charter. So someone might, apologise for anyone who is familiar, you're probably like, oh, ho-hum. But the Borough Charter is a guiding document. So it's not a prescriptive, but what it does is it talks about, it provides a series of principles of how to manage change. And basically these sort of centre around understanding and respecting the cultural heritage significance of that place, making sure that the visual setting is retained, so how you might view that building. So for example, if we have a heritage place and we stick a giant tower in front of it, probably going to interrupt the visual setting. And also compatible use. Change is important. As we mentioned before, use is important. And compatible use is something that allows that building to be used. So they're the principles that the Heritage Council, as well as the department under delegation, consider. So how can you find out about that information? How do we go about managing that change? Well, first off is understanding. So what is important about that place? Fundamentally, what is significant? And we can find that in several places. Each registered place has what's called a statement of significance. You can find it on our website. Local listed places will also have a similar statement. And what that statement does is set out for whatever level, local or state, what's important about it, what story is important. And that's what we judge development against. There might also be some guiding documents, and we encourage any managers of state registered places to commission these documents. They're very useful. So conservation management plan or strategies. They help guide the conservation of those places, but also provide guidance of how that place can be used in the future. So are there zones that allow development to occur or new buildings to occur? Because we're not against new work. New work is often critical to enable that place and that use to continue. So I don't know if you guys can see, there's this example, which hopefully a lot of you are probably familiar with, the Treasury buildings. So that was a great outcome for the state, a state asset that had sat vacant for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. Huge building, huge land holding right in the middle of St George's Terrace. Of course, this was disposed partly, I think, on lease out of government. But it involved a lot of forward planning from government to allow that outcome to be achieved. And what the state, I think they call them the state buildings now, always get stuck in my head, the old Treasury buildings. But by allowing some new insertions into this building, as well as conserving the fabric, you see this amazing outcome. And that's what's possible with the right type of planning. One we also get a lot of is compliance. I see a lot of nods, yes. It's a tricky area. It's something that a lot of heritage architects in private practice deal with a lot. They're nodding too. And it's always slightly difficult with the changes that happen and the upgrades that happen to building codes. It is possible. There are solutions. They just often take a little bit of thinking outside the box to achieve. And when we assess those upgrades, whether it's balustrades or handrails, it's again those interventions that go back to what's important about those buildings. So we see ones where we go, oh, that's not a great outcome, is where someone's gone, oh, we need a handrail slap. Might cut across significant fabric. It affects the visual setting. So for example, Armidale District Hall, I don't know if you see that. New handrails were put on, very unobtrusive. Universal access is often a tricky one as well. But again, it is possible with the right consideration of that fabric. So if you've got for example, Armidale District Hall, you need to put in a universally accessible toilet, for example. They're quite large. It's something that is very difficult to grapple with. You're not going to put it smack bang in the middle of the hall, for example, or the entry, where it's very significant. So for example, with the Armidale District Hall, a new wing was added to the side that allowed all those new services to be located outside of the significant fabric. Again, not always possible, but it might be going, for example, with another one that I worked on, I actually helped put in a universal accessible toilet, was Burt Memorial Hall on the terrace. And that involved the rejigging of the existing sanitary areas so that a universally accessible toilet could be inserted into that space. So again, it is possible. It just needs a little bit of thought. As I said, there's a number of publications on our website that provide a step-by-step guide to some of these issues that are really quite important. We also have, which is a little bit not always up to date, it's called In Contact. We do have a list of heritage consultants. We often recommend with larger projects that you use someone that has extensive experience in heritage trying to manage these places. We often find when agencies or even private owners use consultants that aren't as experienced in heritage, it causes a lot more roadblocks because a lot more redesign has to happen with that heritage input. And this is our website. Our email address. If you ever have a query, or referral, they all come to HECWA referrals@dplh.wa.gov.au. So what about disposing assets out of government? Again, something actually last week I was dealing with when is GHPDP appropriate. So again, at government, we talk about a lot of acronyms. It's always like so overwhelming. So many acronyms. I've had someone say to me, what's GHPDP? What are you talking about? You can see why we acronym it. So GHPDP is a cabinet endorsed policy. It requires that any state owned or managed asset that's over 60 years old or on an existing heritage list or has evidence of heritage significance where demolition or disposal out of government is occurring needs to be referred. So again, people often get caught by that. And tricky ones I've dealt with recently are where we have state land with a leasee. So one I dealt with recently was actually a mill, and it's state land, but the infrastructure is owned by someone else. A tricky one. So what would everyone's thoughts be? Would that be GHPDP? Yes, you'd be correct. So even though it might have a private leasee, heritage values still need to be assessed. It does make it tricky, but it is important for it to be assessed when considering. And early as possible. Under our process, under our regulation, there's 90 days. So we get them, we're like, oh, can we get an answer to next week? And we're like, no, we can't do it that quickly. There is a referral form, but again, please email us if you have any concerns. It's available there's like a flow chart on the website. You Google GHPDP. I do it quite regularly. I'm like, where's the form? You're probably sick of listening to that very dry content. Always fun. So next, before I pass over to people way more experienced and who have much more interesting things to say, I did want to run through this quite relatively a small case study of conservation project for a state asset that had a great outcome, and that something that was identified early, the change was managed, conservation works were executed, and then it stayed in government ownership to achieve a good outcome for that agency. So this is Parry Street in Perth. Department of Communities managed social housing. And I know there's been a lot of push from Minister Kerry recently about social housing, which again is a massive problem within the state. We've been joking in the department, we've got these assets and we go, oh, if only we could do social housing, we'd definitely get money to do that. But again, it's something that needs to be managed. So Parry Street was 7 properties owned by the Department of Communities. So they were previously used for social housing and were in really poor condition. And in fact, one had caught fire. So that's definitely poor condition. All of those places were on the state register. And no, we get queries all the time. Can we just demolish it? We get that a lot. Can you just, it's big, it's in poor condition. Can we just demolish it? I'm like, no, we need to manage that change. And condition isn't always a good reason, because condition doesn't always diminish that significance. Sometimes it does. A lot of the time it doesn't. So Parry Street is significant as an intact streetscape of the 19th and early 20th century. So a very intact streetscape. So not only for the department managed assets, but also for the privately managed assets either side. Those 7 places, I've only got a handful of photos because I didn't want to overload you with quite detailed images, but this one involved extensive structural repairs, new fit out, conservation works to significant fabric. And in the end, what ended up, the outcome of that was 7 properties that were in ready to let state standard. It also reduced the antisocial behaviour that those vacant buildings were attracting. And they're able to be used as social housing again. It's often seen that heritage conservation and repair of heritage assets is a bit of a ball and chain. I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of agencies feel like, oh, this heritage building that we have to, oh, it's so annoying. There are a lot of sustainability benefits, like sustainability outcomes that can be achieved from retaining existing fabric from an environmental perspective. You've got a building that has embodied energy in it. You can retain and reuse it. Although some of the works are more costly than, say, a new building, what it does do is allow those materials to be remained in situ, those values, those heritage values to remain. It's so critical to those places. But there's also economic benefits. So in this example, in this project, a local Aboriginal owned business provided skilled labour. There was an economic boost, which we don't often talk about with these projects. So recycled Jarrah floorboards were used, 45 local suppliers were used, 14 apprentices, 5 female tradespersons, 7 individuals who identified as Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander were used on this project. So it had good social benefits and outcomes as well. So enough of me talking at you. What I did want to say, which I think is really critical for a lot of state agencies to take away from this, and I hope that the other presenters will reinforce that, is that we are custodians. We're custodians as a state of these heritage places that we own and manage. The state is the biggest owner and manager of state registered places in the state. So we have a responsibility to show good governance of these places. And like I said, they're often seen as balls and chains, unfortunately, but there's lots of value that can be had in these projects and in these places that have really good community, social, economic, and cultural heritage outcomes. And that's something that I hope that you'll take away from today's presentation. So enough of me talking. I will pass over to the next presenter and back to Alethea.
Thanks, Catherine. So our next presenter is Brandon Prattley from Griffiths Architects, and he's going to be talking about the conservation work undertaken on Doomar House and the intent to extend the design life by 50 years and how that all came about to fruition. Thanks, Brandon.
Morning, everyone. We're going to talk about this one. Let's go full screen. Where's that? I just want to go full screen, that's all. So
full screen?
Toolbars.
Full screen, there we go.
Excellent. Okay. We started working on this project in 2013, 2014 with Department of Finance, into response to some concerns from occupants about things falling off the building. Big bits of concrete, basically. The initial design commenced in 1964, built in 1996 there. Wow, that's 1966. And steel frame building, essentially wrapped in concrete. As it was finished, clean, pristine. It's a state registered property, one of the better examples of late 20th century international style. It was one of 6 proposed for the site. They only have built one. They would have to demolish some other quite important buildings to finish this proposal, including the Constitutional Centre and a few things down there, maybe even the observatory, but they stopped, thank God. So we got there, external elements are falling off, basements are leaking, there's asbestos everywhere, and they're quite concerned about people getting hit by chunks of concrete falling off the building. So an example of one such chunk of concrete that fell off the building. Later on, the engineer also said, if they're really, really big chunks of concrete, they might also go through the slab. So yeah, not great. So we went back to the conservation plan and looked at the building and what was important. And it comes back to what Catherine was saying. Everything on the external envelope is considerable significance, and it's a like-for-like replacement. So we're going through trying to replace essentially every single element of the exterior of the building apart from the glazing in a like-for-like fashion. So it was looking a bit tired. The concrete precast panels were failing. The grey ceramic blocks had to go. The podium finish leaking. It's skinny, was cracking. Soffits were poor. Stormwater didn't work very well. Asbestos everywhere. And there was a nasty little trip hazard at the podium, which caught people out. So one of the things we did to start this off, to understand what we're in for, was do all the works to one bay first. So we got in there and ripped it all apart, took all the stuff off, see what we had, and then, okay, this is what we're going to need to do to fix it. And this was done also through a special type of contract with the Department of Finance, doing early contractor involvement, where we contracted in a way that was bringing on their advice as part of the design process, and they were tendering a methodology as well. So, and they had to build the first test bay as part of their main contract. So that's what we had when we got there. So the problem was this test bay ended up being kind of the best bit of the building. So it was a good idea, but it was somewhat hamstrung by, oh, that doesn't look too bad, that doesn't look too bad, and the rest was worse. So, but essentially it confirmed what we need to do: replace the spandrels, remove the asbestos, which is all these tiles here. They're asbestos. Every single one of those is asbestos. You have to take those off to do all the waterproofing, so they're not going back. This concrete is falling apart. There's a gutter in there that needs to be ripped out, and all this terrazzo had to come off to get to the concrete. But all the sealant in the terrazzo was asbestos, and every time the terrazzo came off, it broke. So all the terrazzo also had to be replaced. So, and that's what we got to. So this is part of the trial bay where we go back with a new precast panel, new specially manufactured asbestos-like units, but that's a cement fibre. There's no asbestos in there anymore. We won't get away with that. And new waterproofing. And I don't think at that point we had the terrazzo yet. So once that was approved, it was on for young and old, and we basically stripped everything off the entire facade and redid it. So these are what the spandrels look like. This was on the 14th floor, and you can see some of it fallen off previously. Initially, these were back there. These were designed as a one integral piece of concrete. They were built as one bit of concrete with a topping. Ended up the cover on this steel reinforcement was next to nothing. We had 20 to 10 mils of cover on concrete. It just died. So this is all the panels going back on that were precast out at Delta Core. That was, I don't know, I think there was 1,000 or something. It was a lot. And going back on, and we made these panels as one lump of concrete with stainless steel reinforcement. And the building had been there for 50 years. Our brief was another 50 years. So this should last longer. And we also went back, making it easier to take apart and fix it in the future as well, if you need to. So this is what the concrete under the precast panels had in sections after they'd broken out the bad concrete. So all the panels sat on a concrete frame. The water got behind them. The concrete frames also had very poor cover, and all the reinforcement was dying. We had to, in some locations, put new liggers in because they just disappeared. They'd broken completely. So new section put in, broken out, repaired, and then rebuilt, and new pockets put back in to chuck it all in. And also level everything out because the building was a bit wonky and a lot of the gutters didn't fall the right way. So everything got leveled out so it would now deal with water properly as well and wouldn't roll back in. So there's a lot of dealing with where the water went. So all these little pads here were to level out the panels as they went on and deal with it. We also put in a new waterproofing treatment to all the concrete that was behind these panels. So you can see we've got a lot of rebuilding happening and a lot of work involved, and a lot of the discoveries like the soffit was tacked on there with a bird mesh sort of lath, which had rusted completely through, and that would just come off at places. So lots of discovery, but all these spandrel panels had to go. So it was difficult one for us because all these spandrel panels here all had to be replaced, but all this block work was stack bonded and sat on those spandrel panels. So the only way to take that spandrel panel out was to remove all of that block work. Once again, as soon as we touched the block work, it broke and there was asbestos in it. So all that block work was removed. So this is sort of a trial, it just break, and there was asbestos in these joints, and it didn't have any thermal movement gaps, and it was stack bonded. And if that broke in the future, you'd have to rip it off and do it all again. So we actually made all these again. We went to a brick yard and got these all built, custom made and glazed and fired and rebuilt. And there was custom sizes for those blocks as well. Getting the color was probably the hardest bit. That took forever. Lots of tinkering with glazes and firing. You put it through the kiln, come back later, and no, that's crap. Or, oh, we've got a lot of orange peeling, it's blistering, it's not working properly. So that took a while. You can sort of see the stacks as they get, and you get special shapes as well, because all the blocks were mitered on the corner. So we had to build all the special mitered blocks as well. And to put them back, it needed to actually now structurally comply properly. And so the stack bonding before didn't comply with the wind loading. So we had to put some framing in to deal with the wind loading. And this shelf angle here takes all the load for the blockwork above it. So if we have to remove these in the future, we can just take a couple out here. We have to take the whole section out. So we gave ourselves a bit of flexibility for the future to do a bit more work. So just an example of ripping it all off and going again. And yeah, this brickwork behind here was never meant to be seen. It was really poor. And this is all going up, some test panels, some test layouts, picking the best ones, rejecting. There's a lot of rejections, I've got to say, and putting it back in. And just a note, anyone specifying block work, tolerances matter, because they gave us a lot of pluses, but not many minuses. So you get pluses with plus or minus, say, 5 mils, but you have a maximum overall run. If you get all pluses, suddenly it's too big and it won't fit. We might have taken a little block out of the top so it would fit again. So yeah, there was a little biscuit spacer, which is about 20 mils. It got removed because it wouldn't fit anymore. So that was all replaced. So that's every single block replaced. Now the podium. They were very optimistic about concrete back in the day. So when you come to older buildings, the first thing you'll look at is when you try to put any new loads on it, your engineer will go, no, it's not strong enough. This was sort of strong enough, but they designed for strength and not durability. And then they decided to drive cars over this. Every time it was driven on, it cracked, basically. It didn't break, it just cracked. And it leaked and broke the membrane. The membrane was asbestos. That had to come off too. So it was all ground and stuff. So, but there's this little trip hazard here, which they got rid of. But we couldn't strengthen the concrete much. So the whole thing was sealed, done again, and repaved to take out that trip hazard, and then a drain put in here, because it was just, you walk to the balustrade and you just drop into a hole. So it was a nice way to lose your ankles. So all the trip hazards were removed from the podium, which everyone kind of liked. So you can see that was the step there. Now, this is what was under the terrazzo at times. So when the water had got in, it'd done things like this, steel beams just dying. So all the terrazzo had to come off. This is new terrazzo, put back on a new system that actually allows it to be taken off and put back. It's on a hanging system now. So actually, before it was just pinned in, and those pins also were on an angle that allowed the water to go straight into the column. So they sort of made the problem worse. So that's essentially a completed column balcony. And yeah, nice place to stand, apart from there's no handrails. So, and this is what the gutters were like. This is why the water also got in. So these have failed. So look after your waterproofing, guys, because otherwise you've got a bigger problem ahead of you. Much, much bigger. So they all had to be ripped out, redone, and we put copper back because it was copper to start with, but they just laid gunk all over it. You can sort of see the new bits going in. And just here, the water collection system is novel. The water falls from level to level. There's no downpipes. The only downpipe is at the end, which just takes the roof water. All the other water that lands on these balconies just channels to these pops and flows down. These pops were flush before, and the wind would swirl the water around, and it would just smash the soffit and everything around it. So we put little pops in to direct down. It seemed to work, but there was no real way to bring downpipes without putting downpipes in every single bay and changing the complete appearance of the building. So we didn't do that. But the only thing we added to the building was this entry, because everyone used to get wet. So this is on the north face, because the original entries from the building were on the sides underneath the deck. But anecdotally, a lot of those doors used to smash because the sea breeze would come through and knock them open and they'd break. So they got turned into other areas. We've got an entry on the face, north face, and we added this. These are the balcony soffits tiles, all replaced. There was, once again, asbestos in the membranes. There was holes in the concrete. There was random asbestos shims just scattered everywhere. So we think they just carried them around as packers and just dropped them wherever they wanted to. So we just had to deal with that and replace all this. So it was completed in 1966 for $5 million. Pretty cheap. They did a refurb in 2010, 2013 for $50 million. Our complete works were $25 million. Over 2 years, the building was occupied for the entire time, between two governments from Barnett to McGowan. Barnett was pretty good. I think he kept most of his ministers in line. Some of the McGowan ministers wanted to throw a bit of weight around and made it a bit harder to make the noise, so we had some restrictions. But it all got done. We just had to stop every now and then for media conferences because the media room is downstairs, and they'll pull trolley jacks across the podium slab, and you'd end up acting as a drum. I was not very happy when they were doing a press conference with wheels trundling across the roof. It was valued to replace the entire building at $150 million. So for half the price, we've got an asset that is intended to work for another 50 years. Now, due to the nature of the building, you've got a completely open plan that's very flexible, can be adapted, hence the fit out before. And if we do that today, it's going to be even higher. And extending what Catherine said, if you look at the embodied energy in this building, to knock it down, well, you wouldn't knock it down, but to leave it there and then build another one, it's just a waste. So sustainability-wise, it's a much better outcome to do this and crack on with it. And pretty much everything in this building that was used, apart from the terrazzo, was sourced in WA. So all those blocks were made in WA. All these panels were made in WA. The terrazzo came from overseas. We had to buy that in huge slabs. So yeah. Questions? Tactical questions, everyone got any? Yep. Been discussed many times. Yeah, it would help the performance of the building from a thermal point of view. It was also a bit of a source of some concerns because of odors and things coming through. So during the process, a lot of the floors had their air conditioning pressurized to push air out more, so you wouldn't draw as many fumes through. So just managing floor by floor of the works, so we could actually pressurize different floors to control odors was essentially required. Yeah.
What was early contractor involved?
Oh, that was I wouldn't like to do it any other way, because essentially we tendered rates. So we had a rough idea of the budget and we had prices for everything, and then went go. And then when we got there, went there's going to be a bit more of that, and we have a rate for that. So it was one of those projects where if you had a lump sum, you'd just be fighting the contractor all the way on value. So we had a tendered price, and we had lots of rates and provisional amounts. There was a QS along the entire way checking everything. and we did takeoffs. And probably the biggest issue here was time. It dragged on a little bit because of discovery, but that all got amicably resolved. Everyone was happy. I think overall it came under budget for what they had for the precinct, but the precinct, there was lots of other works being done because they had to do things like change their site power because it was all coming from different places. They had to rationalize all of that. So yeah, it was precinct-based works.
Open-ended contracting phase. So obviously there's no fixed lump sum. So how did those early negotiations go between yourselves and the department about using an early contraction for open-ended?
That sort of came from finance, saying they put this together as an option. They want to explore it because of just that problem. It's like there's no way we can get a lump sum for this and get a reasonable outcome, or we'll get such a varied outcome that we won't know. So we did a shortlist process to get people on board who had the ability to do the work, and then we had a tender where we'd have a series of meetings with them over about 8 weeks, which every tenderer attended. They were paid to tender, and they also had a probity officer in the room. So if we said anything that everyone needed to hear, it'd make sure. If it was all meant to be IP stuff and was only for that contractor, it didn't go anywhere else. So that kept the tender process kind of siloed for each tender, and they had to produce samples and all sorts of things to make sure they can deliver what we wanted. So like provide us a sample of that paver, provide us a sample of the panels, provide us a sample of this during the whole process. And then we got a price, we compared them all, and then we just checked it all the way along. So yeah, fairly involved. Sit down.
So now we've got a short break. Introduce the next speaker. We've got Hugh McCaffrey and David Lee Canham, and it's Lincoln, who's talking? Lincoln and Lincoln Tuppen from LT Architects. I'm going to talk about the successful submission to Treasury in terms of installation upgrade to UA compliant footpaths, wayfinding, and installation of an external lift, and how hostile mitigation barriers were installed and impact on accessibility. So take it away.
It's into, isn't it?
Yes, it's the arrow, whichever's easier.
Yeah, so our topic's based on improving accessibility to Parliament to everyone, basically, and then also create an environment that's safe for them to actually come to. So that's probably our biggest priority. So we're going to talk about we're going to touch on the forecourt barrier. So if you've been to Parliament recently, we've got a forecourt barrier system up there. So we've created a controlled area. Now, a few years back, we were given a directive based on some active threats, should I say, that we needed to improve the environment or secure the front of Parliament. And it's all about pedestrian safety. We regularly get groups of people turning up to protest, or young school groups just to gather to go on a tour in Parliament. So we had to respond very quickly to an active threat. So we were given basically very low. But I suppose that project results in why we went to Treasury funding further down the piece. I should put my glasses on here. So basically, the threat, we were given a very short period of time to create a very safe environment. We literally had less than 2 weeks to try and come up with a solution to it. It's free. Now, within those 2 weeks, to try and work out very quickly what to come up with. So we looked at all the obvious solutions, all the barriers you probably see around. You see around Perth and around the world. None of those solutions were available. They've all got extensive lead times. They've also got huge budgets.
Government? No. I think these are some architects presenting, cool. I think. Yeah. So I'm not sure entirely what this is, but forecourt safety. Oh.
Who's talking there?
not part of the presentation.
Sorry, guys, that was us here at DBCA. We just jumped back online, so you've caught us trying to catch up.
Can we see them?
Where are we at?
All right, we'll just continue.
So basically we had a gathering of the heads to try and come up with a quick solution. As I say, we went through all the options, nothing available within a short time frame. A very loose throwaway comment was based on concrete rings to make a chicane system. The concept was we create a chicane that would slow personnel driving through Parliament basically to a walking pace. Strangely enough, this crazy concept was supported by executives. Said if you can do it in the time and you can do it with this limited budget, we need to make it happen now. So following consultation with engineers, the concept in principle could achieve the goal. So we went about. The next stage was how do we actually station these bollards so they will actually have a reduction in speed. If we take normal guides that we will work to in construction, cars would just steam straight through. So we had to try and test on site how we were going to situate these bollards. The good thing is we were able to contact a local bollard supplier who probably got the best PR he ever got in the next couple of years based on these manhole rings that he supplied, and a local contractor. And we were able to come up with a solution that we could install. But before we did that, we needed to test. So this next slide. So on this slide, you'll see this was one of our staff. He's been 45 years service at Parliament, and he's always wanted to do a donut in the forecourt. So I think this was his moment. So he went through there, it may not look like it, 48 k's an hour, and he just nipped that cone on the end. So we had to just keep bringing these bollards in until we got to the point where some people refused to drive through them for the risk of their car. Others enjoyed the challenge, but it was basically a walking space. Now, as you'll see, we also on the side there, we had to create somewhere for fees that in an emergency they could come through. So there's very high tensile steel goes through there, and you will notice Dio in a slightly different dress sense, wearing a section of that chain. I think he thought he was Mr. T for them. So it was a very serious topic, but we had a funny side with it. So the following morning, yes, we'd achieved a goal, but we hit some shocking things. We were expecting this, but it's probably worse than we ever thought. So we were copping a lot of flack from external entities. The press were having a field day, and the members were having a field day. However, the members probably suffered more bad PR from this than us, with Dean Alston making a great caricature of, I think, comparing it to the Royal Show. And I think you'll recognise a lot of faces in there that have probably been mentioned about Dumas House earlier. Anyway, the upshot, yes, we did create an area that we could control. We could slow traffic down. We couldn't stop traffic, but we could control it. But the real positive thing was within 12 months, we received funding to build a purpose-built gate system. So we now have a forecourt that is safe for public gatherings, and it's safe for anyone who wants to come there and gather at the front. So as you'll see in these slides, they're still pretty hardcore barriers. They can still be unsightly. However, our own gardeners, we utilise our gardening team. They took great pride in this. With the use of WA plants, we were able to soften the environment, and I think the outcome was really good. Positives for us. For the first time in Parliament's history, we've now got an area that is secure. And I'm sure people here have seen around the world, cars have been used for dangerous situations to injure people. So for once, we can control that. There's a photograph there of the Nurses Union earlier in the year. We have this on a regular basis, groups of this nature gathering at the front. At least now we can say that they're in a secure environment and nobody can actually impact them. The same will go with, like, any day of the week there's schools visiting Parliament, and they'll be standing around, the kids will be all excited, hanging around the front of Parliament. They're secure. So it's a great outcome for us. Yeah, so we've got that. I suppose one of the other things is the visual appeal. I mean, Parliament is a fabulous building. It's an iconic building, and we've removed the car park from the front of Parliament. So you used to come out of the main entry and you walk down and it was just a parking lot. That's gone. It still has the remnants of a car parking lot. It's still bitumen, but in time, and as part of one of the projects we would talk on earlier, later, that will be, we'll improve that, and we'll try and put a plaza effect outside where people can sit and gather and enjoy the building and actually come and maybe just visit, because it doesn't happen as often as it should. The negatives, well, it's supposedly the people's house. We've just put big gates up on it, so you can't get to it so easily. If you're able-bodied, yes, maybe, but if you've got a disability or an impairment of any sort, all of a sudden it was very hard to get to Parliament. We regularly have aged care buses visiting for tours on school groups or disability groups. They used to be able to drive through the front of the forecourt, park at Parliament, disembark and go straight into the building. And put barriers up, that can't happen anymore. So then we had to create an area a considerable distance from the main entry. So obviously, you know, we just made somewhere very inaccessible for members of society. So we needed to try and address that. One of the minor defects of the whole thing was we lost some parking bays. Not big on the scale of things, but we all know in Perth in parking, it's a bit of an issue. So that was just a minor sort of side of it. So we'd created a system that gave us a secure forecourt, but we knew we'd created a lot more problems for everybody else. So we decided we'd have to create a review of the whole, a master plan basically of the whole reserve. We started working on a master plan, reviewed what we can do around the whole reserve. The key priority was going to be accessibility and making it accessible to every member of the public, but also in a safe environment. Because I think we're all aware, none of us like to think about it. We know the security threats around the world. We're potentially a higher threat than most people, so we had to create somewhere where people can come, feel secure, but we're not creating an environment where they feel like, oh, this is a bit sterile and everything. So we had to try and bring that into the master plan. We knew the priority was the forecourt. That's the gathering area. That's the central area where everyone gathers. That's the main entry, whether it be children, whether it be protests. That's where people want their photograph at the front of Parliament. So that was a key area that needed to be incorporated in the plan. And then we also knew that over Parliament, its history has been about linking certain areas of the city. So Kings Park, West Perth, and the CBD, we were like a pivot point in the middle. And as you'll see from this next slide, there's been some great designs over the years, basically opened Parliament up to the city. This one was in 1988. This is based on previous submissions from the 60s. So it's going back a long way. Probably would have been affordable in 1960 and maybe 1980. No longer affordable. So we weren't trying to replicate this sort of thing. We'd love to, but we knew we couldn't. So our plan was basically just how we could create links with Kings Park and possibly West Perth. So how we could make that corridor through, because we're a little hill that's in the middle. It's an impairment for people. So this, we just touched on it now. This is basically the concept we come up with, and it's really about improving north to south, east to west, so we can get across. And there's several little projects involved in it. So we'll come back to that later in the piece. So we had all these things working in the background, and it comes to light. So every year we put a funding submission into Treasury for support for additional work, so we can't afford that. Our budget's quite tight. We couldn't afford. Every year the documents produced very high class. There's a group of people assigned to it, and I must say I've only been involved in giving them information, but some of the documents are provided outstanding. Unfortunately, every year they fail, and we declined. With that, and I'm sure every department suffers the same, is if you put a submission in and you're declined, you lose funding that you already have. So we've lost funding several years, one after the other. The decision was made that we wouldn't put a funding submission in because we couldn't run the risk again. That changed 2 weeks out. We were told, no, we will put a submission in. And you haven't got the team to work with. Basically, our little team had to put this submission together. And we're project managers, we're builders, probably not business case writers of that level. So for us, it was a huge concern. If we professionals couldn't get it across the line, what were we going to do differently? That was the dilemma for us. I suppose the positive was we'd been working on this strategic plan. Everyone knows accessibility is a key driver. So we had a base model. We just then needed to know probably how to sell it to Treasury. So we went about what way are we going to do this. The key factor was going to be public accessibility, making Parliament accessible to everyone, whether you want to come to Parliament or whether you want to go through Parliament, or you're coming from King's Park and you want to do a diversion across, just to make it accessible, somewhere where they can come, maybe have a pit stop. So that was our key objective. We'd already had plans, and LT Architects are going to talk about some of those afterwards, but we'd already had plans that were fairly broad brush, but we then started honing in on the detail. We spoke to King's Park because they've been a fabulous resource for us. They've engaged because they love the concept of all of a sudden making King's Park in connection with the CBD. At the moment, you leave the CBD and then you just look at the big hill and you think, oh my God, I'll get Uber, because you just don't want to go there. Our aim was to try and create a pit stop. So somebody might stop along the way, take in Parliament, and then move up to King's Park. So they've been great. They've come up, so they've actually helped us with the landscape designs. That was incorporated in the submission. We spoke to Heritage themselves. You talked earlier about early engagement, to run our ideas past them to see what they thought, were we heading in the right direction, and would they be behind these ideas? I think that was a key driver within our submission. And then, of course, we went through the costings, because let's face it, that's what Treasury are really involved in. That's their thing. So every element of the projects, and there was 11 key areas, we itemised them individually. So they were all costed individually. In a real world, and if I had a magic wand, we would have loved all 11. We knew by the costs involved we weren't going to get all 11. But the cost we presented as part of the package was detailed, and it gave them their sort of stage payments because it was spread over 4 years. So we gave them clear guides of when we would be calling on money from Treasury, when we would be releasing money to contractors, etc., etc. So they had a clear understanding of where we were going, and I think it probably told them we had an idea of where we were going or hoping to go. And then I say that the other point there is deliverables. That's the same thing. So we gave deliverables on the costings and the projects as they went. And again, this was touched on earlier, compliance with the construction codes and the BCA. I think everyone's aware that we're a very old building and we can't comply every time. And in some cases, we don't have to comply, but we want to comply. We want to try and comply as close to possible. I don't see why we don't need to, why we should be exempt. So every stage of the plan related back to both of those organisations to say that we're complying in this way, and gave comparisons. And then I've also add a bit of weight to our sort of support package. We looked at the public sector and looked where they were going. So obviously they got their disability plan. And I suppose just to add weight, finally, we went to Treasury and had a look to see where they were going. Obviously, they're all working in newer buildings than us, but we tried to marry in with everyone. So really, whilst we're not government entity, as people think we are, we're all trying to move in the same direction. So our plan clearly stated all of these things. And then I think the final point, which is possibly the most important, is we wanted to meet public expectation. The public don't come to our buildings possibly understanding the construction codes or knowing what's in the construction codes. But if they're in a wheelchair or if they've got whatever their impairment, they know what works for them. So we tried to understand that and look at the little hazards that we've had and try to incorporate improvements to make those things achievable and access achievable. So as I say, we broke it all down to make it cost effective. But the 11 projects as a group, considerable number. Probably not a considerable number for some of the projects we're talking about. For Parliament's mini budget, it was a considerable number. So they would be giving us more as an additional funding than they give us as funding. So we knew that wasn't going to happen. So we identified the projects. The numbers are really just the way we worked across the plan. They're not priorities, but we identified some of the key areas. And for us, number 5, which is a lift, and that's the lift that from the upper concourse. If you're coming from West Perth, you come through Parliament, then all of a sudden you're faced with stairs. So there's no option. And then the only way we can send somebody if they're in a wheelchair is we So yeah, just head off down Hay Street and go down the hill, and then you'll get the other big hill at the other corner. So don't worry about that, but that's off our reserve. So we knew that you can't just keep doing that, which has been done for years. So we tried to look at making number 5 our key objective, and basically that will be a lift that's open to everyone. But at this point, I'll pass over to Luke Giels to actually discuss how they went about the proposal and how we incorporated that in.
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, I guess I'll briefly touch on the works that we've completed to date and what's currently ongoing. So in terms of items that were on the previous plan, we essentially did items 1 and 2. So as Hugh touched on, when the vehicle barriers went in, we did lose a significant amount of parking on the forecourt. So what is not highlighted in that plan is to the left of the plan is what the old tennis courts used to be. Parliamentarians don't play tennis anymore, so it was the obvious spot to put an overflow car park. I realise I've committed the cardinal sin. I've not put a north point on this plan, so it's the southern car park, but it is to the left on this diagram. Effectively, what that did was it immediately was an entry off Harvest Terrace. So we basically moved traffic immediately away from the forecourt. They entered the from Harvest Terrace, and immediately had the car park to the left. And effectively, once they were there, we had to figure out how we were going to manage that pedestrian flow. So at the moment, well, not anymore, the only option they had was to walk down the roadway towards the forecourt or use the stairs, as Hugh touched on. So we basically had to figure out how we were going to funnel pedestrian traffic, and we obviously took that as an opportunity to create accessible pathways, lead them towards areas of accessibility, which is the location for the lift, which we'll touch on in a bit. We went through multiple scenarios. We chose a pathway through the members' car park. As being the members' car park, it was obviously very well lit and very well secure with all the Mercedes BMWs in there. So it was an obvious choice to put the footpath. Obviously, there were existing trees around the area that we had to be very careful about when we did some regrading, because obviously being a footpath, we wanted it to have the correct gradients. So once we had selected that location, then met with Heritage to ensure that it aligned with the conservation plan, understand that we're all on the same page. And effectively, what it did as well was it gave us opportunities for additional landscaping. So we used landscaping as a means to direct pedestrians so that they weren't going to walk on the roadways. And that, of course, gave us the opportunity to reintroduce some native vegetation into the space. Then, yeah, effectively, it then enabled us to bring pedestrian traffic to the next slide. So that, in turn, made us address the existing stairs that Hugh touched on. So at the moment, the only way that pedestrians can get to the lower levels of the concourse is either, as Hugh said, go along Hay Street. They can go down the roadway, but if they're in a wheelchair, they'll be coming in at a very high speed once they get to the end of that hill. So we went through multiple areas, locations throughout Parliament Reserve, but we found that the area next to the stairs was the most logical, given that it connected to public levels, and that putting the car park and the footpath previously, we were now effectively funneling pedestrian traffic to that spot of accessibility. So the design of the lift shaft, we go to the next slide. The other reason we picked that spot was because it was a very densely landscaped area. There was a lot of trees and vegetation around the area. So effectively, the design of the lift, we wanted to incorporate that landscaping. So currently the proposal, which just went through DA, is a concrete shaft, but we're going to clad it with wet forge and encourage some creeper growth. So effectively it disappears into that vegetation. At the same time, the existing stairs that are there are your classic exposed concrete, open tread, non-compliant, no nosings, no TGSIs, no handrails. So we will be addressing the existing stair as part of this project. But also security is the number one concern over at Parliament Grounds. So while we are integrating into the vegetation, we're also removing a lot of hidey holes that the stairs currently have. At the moment, the stairs are open on the underside, so people can potentially hide in there. So while we're working there and putting the lift shaft, we are also addressing the security of the space, using that web forge material to close off the open areas so that it just blends into the landscaping, but we're also improving the safety and security of the area. And then, yeah, effectively, once the lift shaft has been installed, you have a universally accessible pathway to the front steps of Parliament. And then eventually, well, as with all the other numbers on the master plan, hopefully they all go ahead, Dave. We can improve areas elsewhere, but that's currently what's in the pipeline at the moment.
So just touch up. So the rest of the items, they are on our wish list, and hopefully they will come on at some point. Some of them are minor, some of them are major. So like number 10 would be a very minor additional ramp that we can probably pick up in our own budget next year. Number 7 would be similar to a Kings Park through the trees, Miranda around through the trees. And we're hoping to get that approved based on that's not only will it provide accessibility, it will also be sort of an educational tour for kids. So we'll try and at the moment, children turn up at Parliament and they've got certain plaques they have to find. And to be honest, you can see them pretty soon going, oh, is that it? So we want to try and create it. So we want to make it so when they come to Parliament, they really have an experience, and then they can sort of move on to the Conservation Centre up the road, etc. and have a field day. So that's pretty much where we're going. Hopefully some of it's going to be completed next year. The list should be completed next year. The footpaths, sort of number 2 identified, that's complete. Number 1 we have completed, and the red bus drop on the top we've completed. So we hope to sort of move forward with the others sort of steadily. Number 11, I think we're going to try and fund that internally as well. So we've made great headway, and a lot of that is it's all based to the funding support from Treasury. That's for us has had a big knock-on effect. We've been given money from other sources based on the plans we've put forward. So it's had a positive result for Parliament, and I think primarily it's because we're trying to make Parliament accessible to everyone, and that's probably the key in the whole submission. Okay, that's it. So.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll press on with the next presentation. Right, that one. So the next presentation is Daniel Stevens from Water Corp, and he'll be talking about Water Corp's heritage asset management, disposals and maintenance using a case study of the Goldfields pipeline. Thanks, Daniel.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Yeah, look, I'm from Water Corporation. I did have a theme for this, which I was going to put up on the title there, called Development, Divestment and Demolition. Sounds a little bit contentious, so I didn't want to put it in writing, and it's honestly not meant to be. We do love our heritage at the Water Corporation. They're good at technology though. How would I get to the next screen?
And press down. There we go.
Oh, look at that. Oh, thank you. Okay. So look, just a little bit about the Water Corporation. As most people probably know, we're the main water service provider of water, sewer and drainage services in WA. Also provide some irrigation services. There are some other utilities, but Water Corporation is the primary one. We're a fairly big company, 4,000 employees, and whilst we're part of the broader family of state government, technically we're not part of the public service. We're a government trading enterprise, so we work on a corporate model. We have a CEO and a board, and we're owned by the WA government, and we're accountable to the Minister for Water, the Treasurer, and this new thing called the Government Trading Enterprise Minister, which I don't know a lot about, so please don't ask me about that later on. In terms of our heritage assets, we have many heritage assets across state, local and national heritage places. So up on the screen in the top left just there is the Leonora buttress tank. was the original water supply for Leonora. Obviously not anymore. It's quite old and it's empty. Bottom left is a drain. It's Lennox Weir in the city of Busselton. And to the top right-hand side is a water pipeline. So I'd ask you to guess Antiques Roadshow style, but maybe I'll just tell you the buttress tank, that's a state registered place. The Weir is a MHI, City of Busselton, locally listed place. And the water pipe is actually part of the Goldfields Water Supply Scheme, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the future. Going back to us being a government trading enterprise, I think initially we were regulated very much like we were part of the private sector. In 2012, we got new operating legislation, the Water Services Act, which basically made us what most of the state government agencies in this room would be. We're a public authority and we're a Section 6 body. So that means that for places like Lennox Weir, we're not actually bound by local government town planning schemes. So there's not a regulatory framework, but an important part about Section 6 is that if we're doing any development activities, we do have to have regard to the purpose and intent of any planning schemes that apply to the land, and we do have to consult with the local government. So even though that exemption now exists, there's an important mechanism in there for us to talk to local government, which really is one of our most important stakeholders. In terms of the state registered places, Section 6 exempts us from local planning schemes. We still need to comply with region planning schemes in the region scheme areas, although there are some fairly good exemptions. So probably 99% of cases, we don't go through a normal development approval pathway. Essentially, Water Corporation becomes the decision-making body and does a direct referral to the Heritage Council. So I think, as you were saying before, we get on the phone a lot because quite often we don't know exactly what to do. So yeah, DPLH has been quite good in giving us that guidance. Okay, this screen is divestment. I think it was said before, if you have a heritage place and you're managing it, you really have to use it or you lose it. For the state government sector, a lot of our heritage assets are located on Crown land. If it's located on freehold land, you have a lot more options to deal with because subject to the Heritage Act processes, essentially you can put a for sale sign up and there's money inherent in or value inherent in the land, and you can unlock that capital to do something good with that heritage place. If it's on Crown land, your options are very much more limited. Water Corporation, we're a water utility, so whilst I'd like to say we do a pretty good job of managing our water assets, there hasn't been a boil water alert for quite some time that I can recall. If it's a non-operational site and we don't have operational use for it, we're not always the best agency to be managing that place, which is where we get to divestment. So I've got two examples up there. They're both on Crown land, so they're not places that we can just sell. The first one is part of the original wastewater scheme for Perth. It's a 1913 building. It's on the State Heritage List. It's in Langley Park, just down the bottom of Hill Street. It had been empty for years and years and years. We weren't doing anything with it. We probably weren't the best manager for it. We'd had some approaches from various parties. It never got off the ground until eventually the City of Perth came to us. The city has quite a large commercial leasing portfolio, and they were quite interested in putting it to market just to see what possibilities there are out there. So being reasonable, and also I don't think the city would have been interested in taking the management order for the land without us being reasonable. The building was in quite a dilapidated state, so we had to do quite a lot, especially to the roof. There was some quite severe white ant attack. So we had to get it in reasonably good shape. It's quite, despite being a wastewater pumping station, it is quite a beautiful building. All of the ceiling lining was replaced with recycled Jarrah floorboards, which is what was up there originally. The trusses were originally Oregon. Back in the day, a lot of Oregon came into Perth. We couldn't readily get that. We couldn't get it at a reasonable price either. So through the Heritage Act process and through talking to DPLH, we came up with the solution of just using a laminate, so it was equally strong. It looks reasonably good. It doesn't really look like Oregon, but I think the end product was quite good. So hopefully at some point in the near future, the City of Perth will find a tenant for it and there'll be a better use for that land. The second structure up there, has anyone into the rectangular oval? You know what it is? Yeah, it's the Lincoln Street Tower. So it was originally a sewage ventilation stack. So back in the day, the sewage system, it wasn't a closed system like it is now. It had to vent all of the horrible gases, including hydrogen sulfide, which smells like rotten eggs. The problem with this structure was that as soon as the hydrogen sulfide came out, mingled with a bit of water in the atmosphere, created sulfuric acid. The ventilation fans in there just ate away very, very quickly. The building was only used, I think, for probably less than a year. That's why it's called Dumas Folly. It was built at that time, and it's really just a folly, but it is an important landmark, and it's a state registered place. The land holding is fairly small, and it's a fairly complicated engineering structure that it's being realistic. It's unlikely that we would find another state agency to divest it to. So the next best option is to lease a license. So with this one, it's right next door to the old Highgate Hill police station, which is also a state registered place. And the historical society resides there. They've got all of the police history stuff in there. They've got a license agreement to occupy. There's a classroom in the bottom of the building. So if they take people onto site and they need to do some lectures, there's a little lecture hall there. I guess a tip for state agencies with this one is if you have Crown land, and we weren't fully savvy to this originally, but under the Land Administration Act, there is management orders created typically for Crown reserves, and they have a defined use, and they also have a power to lease or license. So it's very important that if you want to find a better adaptive reuse for your Crown land site, speak to DPLH Land Services, make sure that the management order gives you that legal ability to lease or license, and also make sure you've got that ability for the purpose under the management order, because arguably, if the management order says for sewage purposes, we've got quite a finite audience that we can offer this to. If you're broadening it out a bit, you're getting a better chance of using it. So that's divestment. This one's demolition, which sounds horrible, but it really isn't. This is the Goldfields water supply scheme I wanted to talk about now. It's Water Corporation's most important heritage asset, and probably one of the state's most important heritage assets. And that was recognised in 2011 when it was placed on the National Heritage List. What that means is that it's regulated in addition to the state legal framework. It's also subject to the federal government EPBC Act, so the federal government environmental legislation. State agencies run across that legislation all the time, but not normally for heritage. So it regulates a fairly broad range of environmental matters, and the one that everybody interacts with, I'm sure you've heard of Carnaby's cockatoo habitat. That's an everyday thing, and there are quite good guidelines to quantify what an impact might be, but for a heritage place, it's a lot more subjective, can be a little bit more difficult to deal with. Going on back to divestment a little bit, there are 16 different elements to the Goldfields water supply scheme. Some of those have been vested with the National Trust. So the number one pumping station is a museum at Mundaring Weir that the National Trust occupy. Some of the other pumping stations are jointly vested with local government, but the Water Corporation still does manage the operational components, including Mundaring Weir, Mount Charlotte out at Kalgoorlie, and what I'm here to talk about today, the main conduit of the Goldfields scheme, which is the main pipeline between Mundaring and Kalgoorlie. This is the main conduit. So it's 560 kilometres long. It supplies around 100,000 customers with their water, and it's getting pretty old. 90% of it's still an above ground pipe, and about 40% of the scheme is still the original locking bar pipe from the early 1900s. So it's been a very durable asset, but as you can see from those photographs, it's getting pretty old and it is prone to leaks and bursts. So if you have it running through your back garden, we're driving along Great Eastern Highway and it goes up, that's not a good thing. So we needed to address that some way. So in 2019, we made a referral under the EPBC Act to upgrade the main conduit of the Goldfields Water Supply Scheme. We were mindful that our projects normally will replace a couple of kilometres of pipe at a time, and we could have done individual referrals for each of those, but with a lot of heritage places, it's death by 1,000 cuts. So we wanted to take like a longer strategic view that recognised that not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but maybe in 50 years' time, if we keep doing these small referrals and the pipe disappears from the landscape, it is going to have a cumulative impact on the heritage values. So instead of doing little mini referrals, we did a maxi referral. We went for 50 years, and the proposal, we took the view that putting in the new below ground pipe, it's not going to have an impact on the heritage values under the EPBC Act. We can do it in such a way that there won't be an impact. It's something that we need to do. We need to keep water flowing through the taps. We need to keep our customers supplied with water. What will happen though eventually is over 10, 20, 30 years time, if we don't address the heritage issue of what to do with that pipeline, it'll build up in the landscape, and we're talking hundreds of kilometres of pipe. That pipe, apart from being of enormous heritage value, you can't just leave it there. It's a steel pipe, so when it doesn't have the moderating effect of water flowing through it, it heats up in the sun, it buckles. The concrete overheads that hold it in place will crack. It's not a great thing it's not a great way to treat a national heritage place. It's also a constraint on other parties. So you can see the photograph up there. It's running through the middle of a farmer's paddock. Quite often, back in 1901, when this thing was getting built, we didn't go out and get easements. So if we want to access private land now, we need to do the right thing and compensate landowners. So rather than getting a corridor that accommodates an historic pipe, a new underground pipe, and an access track, and takes up a whole lot of space, it's more efficient to focus on just the underground pipe and the access track and keep the heritage where it's important. I was speaking to main roads before because you're in the room. A lot of it's also next to Great Eastern Highway. There's been a lot of incidents, unfortunately, of vehicular impacts, so road trains going into it. Great Eastern Highway has had a lot of important safety upgrades. They'll need to keep happening, and sometimes the pipe is right next to the highway, so we need to consider that safety value against the heritage value of the pipe. In 2022, the federal government gave us our EPBC Act approval, which was fantastic. They gave us 70 years. I think they recognised the long-term nature of the project. As part of our proposal, we said that if you give us approval for this, we'll do a heritage management plan. Because the asset's been divided between the National Trust, local government and Water Corporation, there's never been a single document to conserve the heritage values of the place, but also to set out a rule book of what you can and can't do. So for us, that was quite important. So we put that as part of our proposal. We also recognise that the pipeline, even though it's a constraint, it's a very important heritage place, and both the Water Corporation and general community are not going to be happy with it completely disappearing. We need to keep parts of the pipe in situ, and where we can't keep it for very good operational reasons, we need to look at the best option, which is interpreting those heritage values. So those two items that were part of the proposal opt out as conditions on the approval. An interesting condition that also came out that I wasn't expecting was for us to do a public history research project. So in the past, we'd had a few attempts at going to the public and saying, look, eventually this pipeline will slowly disappear from the landscape. What's important to you? What interpretive devices would you like to see to commemorate its heritage values? And just saying that, I feel like I don't even understand what I'm saying. It's quite an abstract concept, and we didn't get very good feedback from the public at all. So the condition that was imposed, I think, was actually really beneficial. It said, go and do this research project, see what's important to the public. What are their values? What are their memories? How do they interact with it? And from that, don't ask the public, but come up with basically a proposal that will inform the interpretation of the scheme. So we weren't putting that complex and abstract question out there. We were just asking the public, what's important to you? And we'll address that with our interpretation strategy. In Water Corporation, there's just one heritage officer. It's me, and I do town planning and land as well. So, and to be honest, it's getting a little bit beyond my capabilities to do something like this. So we went to market and we got a consultant team on board, and there was a lot of interest in it, and we got a really good team on board headed up by H&H Architects, who are a regionally based architecture firm down in Albany, Stephen Carrick Architects, and also some people to help with community consultation. So the Goldfields Community Aboriginal Language Centre were involved to help speak to the Aboriginal communities that need to be involved in this project. There was another Aboriginal community engagement specialist involved, Jordan Consultancy, and an historian. So that project wrapped up. We've branded it Stories in the Pipeline. You can find it on Google if you want to have a look at it. I think that they did, the consultant team, quite a good job on it. And we've moved into the next two phases of the project, which are the heritage management plan and the interpretation strategy. So this is my last slide. It's to do with the interpretation strategy. There's not a lot that I could say because I only got the first draft of the document last week and haven't actually read it yet. But it's the methodology behind it is something I just wanted to share briefly. If a heritage place can't be kept, it still has important heritage values. So it's important to interpret those. So that's what the strategy is all about. The methodology that we used is, firstly, we did a interpretive context and precedent analysis. So the National Trust have done a lot of great interpretation already. They run the Golden Pipeline Heritage Trail. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we went and did a big catalogue of everything that's out there and said, that's been done. We don't need to do it again. The precedents analysis was a bit of an inspiration piece. So we looked around Australia, around the world, and had a bit of a check out of what's been done in other situations. Goldfields scheme, it's a very wide ranging, not just geographically, but also in terms of its heritage values. It touches on a lot of different heritage themes. So the next step in the process was we looked at the state and national thematic framework that we felt applied to the scheme. And rather than trying to tell all of the stories, we narrowed it down to just three, which you can see up there. And then within those themes, we looked at what stories we might want to tell. And there's so many stories, and a lot of them have already been told. So everybody knows about C.Y. O'Connor and John Forrest. You learn about that in primary school. There's other stories, around the Locking Bar pipe, around the Afghan cameleers that helped open up that part of the world. They're somewhat known, but they're not told all of the time. And then there's the forgotten and untold stories. So when the scheme was being created, it did unfortunately have an impact on a lot of important Aboriginal heritage places. The European settlement, essentially, and not just Water Corporation, but Main Roads and the Public Transport Authority with our assets, they're only there because Aboriginal people have been there beforehand, and a lot of us linked to water. As our state developed, it only developed because those pre-existing Aboriginal heritage places were there, and a lot of them, it had a pretty terrible impact. And that's a story that hasn't been told enough, and it's something that we'd like to tell. So in terms of the storytelling principle, that's what at this stage, and it's just a draft document, we're hoping to focus on. So those stories that are told some of the time, and those forgotten and untold stories. Yeah, so look, that's pretty much where we're at now. Because it's a federal government process, we need to deal with the Australian Heritage Council. So we'll need their endorsement, and it will need to be signed off by the Federal Environment Minister. Canberra's like a really long way away. So the WA community, like for me personally, is probably a lot more important. So we have done a lot of community consultation as well. It's not, for me, heritage shouldn't be a like a technocratic thing that somebody in the Water Corporation or Heritage Council sort of decides on. It's something that you've really got to bring the community with and understand what the community values. So we will be doing some more public consultation, hopefully in June or July, just to see what everyone thinks about how we're planning to interpret the Goldfield scheme. And then after that, we'll move forward to our federal approvals. So thanks, that's everything.
What other questions?
The question screen.
You know, as Waterfall part of the region that they should have the say about what is heritage present kind of thing,
Yeah.
that non-technocratic approach. How did you manage to instill that into your organisation? Because I know that approach is something that my department in particular would have issue with, of, you know, oh, we don't think that building's important.
Yeah.
And then so not necessarily taking on that value of non-technocratic approach.
Look, there's a diversity of views in the Water Corporation.
Yeah.
There's a lot of engineers who just want to build and demolish. But there's also a lot of people in the Water Corporation who are passionate about heritage, and a lot of Water Corporation staff were members of the National Trust or historical societies and other interest groups that have that genuine passion. And as being the person who has to look after the heritage approvals, I'm very mindful it's really not my decision on how things proceed, and probably the most difficult thing is getting consensus within your business. So you need to have a lot of conversations, but more broadly than that, and I think it's explicit in the heritage legislation, whilst the council and heritage minister do make the decision, there's always a public consultation process, but quite often that is something that might be a small ad published in the back of the paper, and that ticks the legislative box. And for me, like in an ideal world, particularly for private sector developers, they're just trying to turn a profit in many cases. But for something like the Goldfield scheme, it's such an important heritage place, you need to do a little bit extra. And if you don't do a little bit extra, not only will you not necessarily get a good outcome, the community won't be happy. So we try not to be, I guess, restricted by the minimum requirements of the law a little bit more if we can.
And so do you have an internal policy for that? Or you just
We do have a policy, but it's funny. A lot of it goes back to divestment. So we recognise that heritage places, if they're not being used, they can decay quite rapidly. So that's really our primary objective of our policy is divestment. So yeah. Anyone else? Okay, thank you for listening.
The last presenter is Christopher Patterson from Christopher Patterson Heritage and Architecture, and he, if I can make it stay, will talk about benefits of investigations and planned works using Victoria Quay as a case study.
Good morning, everybody. So you might wonder why we're looking at a submarine. Well, it's actually quite pertinent because we just like to talk with you a little bit about some site-specific constraints, things that might help you to progress your projects. And in this instance, we're going to look at the area at the southwest end of Victoria Quay, in and around the Maritime Museum, the Gage Road Brewery sort of area. And this is, of course, HMAS Evans. And despite the rather distorted wide-angle image, the building behind is the winch room that pulled that vessel out of the water to its final resting place. Now, let's see if I can drive this. I'm not a PC user. Yeah. So I think we're going to talk about some very small specific projects. They're going to be very much related to the greater scale of things that Brendan has talked about, things that you find at Parliament, but they're smaller scale. You might come across these issues on your day-to-day maintenance. The first thing, whether it be large or small, is very, very helpful to really understand your place. And by place, we mean building, structures, landscape, surrounds, and so on. And in the case of our winch room at Victoria Quay, there it is on the left-hand image, and you can see the slipway structure in between. So that is a pretty old image from the 40s on the left, a slightly later image on the 60s on the right, and you can see the large winch room, and in fact the smaller winch room to its right. The large winch room is the very squarish building in the middle. And this is pretty important because you see just how close this thing is to the water. And as we all know, anything that you have near the ocean, you have issues of maintenance that are quite different from something, for example, at Kalgoorlie. Kalgoorlie, you can probably put your sheet of corrugated iron out, and 100 years later, it's still going to look pretty much like a sheet of corrugated iron. It won't do that here. So this is our large winch room on the left. There's the submarine behind. And this project, which is an active project, is going to address asbestos remediation. So the roof is asbestos, the gutters are asbestos, the upper wall lining is asbestos. The asbestos has got absolutely everywhere. It is in the building, it's in the structure, it's in the ground around about the building. This is a very challenging thing to fix. It's become sufficiently challenging that it really hasn't been looked after very well as a building. And so the asbestos issue becomes other things. The downpipe, no one's really cleared the downpipe. The water has been splashing around all over the place. And now on that bottom right-hand image, this is what happens. We have a very large 200 millimeter square piece of jarrah that is totally destroyed at the bottom. A little bit of love earlier would have prevented what's going to be now a very expensive remedial exercise. Now, just to look at the environmental conditions, there's the large winch room on the green in there. It's surrounded by other industrial buildings. It's the big Maritime Museum just to the north. And now you can place the building better on the aerial photograph on the left. That's the Indian Ocean out there. Southwest is straight to the top left-hand corner. Every day in the summer, we're getting a huge quantity of very salt-laden wind coming in. It's a super obvious site to analyze. We all know how windy it gets here. We love the Fremantle Doctor, but it's just an example of a site-specific condition. And wherever you are, it's worth understanding your site. Now, you will get other site constraints. It's not just which direction the weather is coming from. For example, here, Brendan talked about asbestos. there are other things that you might find on your buildings. This is in the large winch room at Fremantle Port. There's a large selection of cans of paint, some of which have lead in paint. If you are working with any of your buildings in 1970s, there's a very good chance you're going to find you have lead in paint. And that's going to require a specific means of preparing the surfaces before you can repaint. It's not insurmountable, but if you can understand it early in the piece, you can plan for it. It will take a little bit longer and it will cost a little bit more. Sometimes you have some other little delights. So here's the tins of paint, and in the foreground, someone just filled a bag full of asbestos product and left it there. That's just added joy. In the middle, we have a switchboard. You might think, well, what's hard about that? Well, a lot of old switchboards contained asbestos. So the backing material was an asbestos sheet. Asbestos comes in various different types. It can be loose, friable, or it can be contained. It can all be dealt with, but it's better that you find out as clients and as consultants long before your builder says, I've got news for you, and it's going to cost you this much, and it's going to take this much longer. You just don't need to hear that. A little bit of checking beforehand, and you can find out this. You'll find asbestos in all sorts of places. You'll find it underneath sinks. You know, that black material that stops the drummy sound of your sink when you turn the tap on an older building, that's very likely got to have some asbestos content. You'll find it in window putty. You'll find it, as Brendan's saying, in tiles, in adhesives, under vinyls, in vinyls. It sounds like it's a horror story, but it's only a horror story if the person that finds out is your building contractor, because that's when all your costs start to rack up. Now, other things that's good to understand about your site is, how do you expect that building contractor to undertake their work? This is not a government building. It's not at Fremantle. It's right in the middle of the city. It's Lawson's Flats. It's a beautiful Art Deco building. It has no parking for residents. It has no parking for tenants. It has no parking for builders. It has no laydown area. It is an absolute nightmare to work on. But again, if you find this out beforehand, it can all be planned in and not as a huge shock on day one. And it does happen. People do get these shocks. So all we're saying here is, let's understand our place. About understanding the user needs. You are all government agencies. You are delivering a service. Sometimes, and we're talking about divestment of properties earlier, sometimes understanding if the place is really going to work for you is perhaps the most important thing. This little building is a government building. It has public access. It has members of the public coming to meetings and all sorts of things. It's got a step at the front door. It's got several steps at the back door. It has started life as a house with some extension. And you can see that the people working there have done their best to keep it up to date with what do they need with technology, with cabling, with all sorts of things. And it's not worked for the occupants. It doesn't work for the visitors. And I think it's fair to say it's really not loved. It's not appropriate. Because it's not loved, then no one takes care of the windows. So those windows in that image, those are now at a point of repair before painting, as opposed to prepare and paint. So the $300 painting exercise for that window has now become $1,000 repair and paint exercise, and that does impact you as building managers. Tradespeople also struggle to make these things work, and you can see in the bottom right, somebody's just smashed a vent brick to pieces to get their cabling in. And by the way, the cabling's now become redundant. It's been cut off. So we've got non-functioning technology. We've got damage to heritage building. We've got increased costs, and we've got lessening of significance. So when we're talking about appropriateness of place and divestment, it's something to think about. You know, is this a good place to spend your money, or would someone else make better use of it? On the other hand, down back to Fremantle, this is the new offices for the Maritime Museum, and it is in the old plumber's workshop. And you can see the building in the top left. That was it before works. It was definitely in need of some care and attention. The client here spent a bit of time engaging us to do feasibility studies and see what we could do to come up with a new use for them. They were being essentially evicted from their old offices, which were where the new Gage Road Brewery is. And you can see that, in fact, this creates quite a fun office for the Maritime Museum admin team. The building's not over restored. The old trusses and everything are kept really just clean. They weren't even repainted. And a little nod to their maritime heritage. Even the air conditioning ducts were made of sailcloth, so it had that maritime feel to it. So micro scale compared to Dumas House, but a little bit of time spent at the beginning found a new use for the building and a happy end user. And so there merit in a feasibility plan or a feasibility study or a maintenance plan. Well, we really think there is. And clearly, if you're spending $25 million working on Dumas House, you're doing an awful lot of pre-planning. But you might have a very much smaller project, and there is merit to you in doing some extra study, and there'll be people out there to help you. There's people like Brendan's practice or ours or LT Architects and others who you'll find on the DPLH website to give you some guidance. The biggest thing that can help any project in our experience is having a good brief. And a brief is like a question. If you ask a good question, you get a sensible answer. If your question's wishy-washy, something you ask at the cocktail party, you're going to get a wishy-washy answer back. It's just the nature of what they are. So your role as building managers is critical in helping the design team. And I can tell you, we get briefs that are literally 2 lines on an email. That's not a super brief, but you need to ask your consultants to help you develop the brief so you really understand the story. Explore the issues. We've just had a little look at that with some of the challenges, say, at Victoria Quay. And at these very early feasibility stages, it's the best time to put forward any ideas because we're sitting around the table. It's almost free. You know, it's a few hours of time to push some ideas back and forward, as opposed to changing your mind when you're just about to go to tender. It sounds straightforward, but we get so many changes during construction. It's amazing. You do manage to take the time to do a feasibility study or a maintenance plan. Allows you to prioritize the work, maybe to stage the works as well, as I think happened to some extent at Dumas House, doing that early contractor investigation. Might also help give you the opportunity to look at things like lead times, expensive times to build, and so on. And it also lets you group things together that might not become immediately apparent. And of course, most importantly, lets your budgets be worked out. And I would just say a feasibility study or maintenance plan is not, it's not a building condition assessment. Those BCA reports that you get, they just give you a list of here's defects. What the maintenance plan or feasibility does is allow you to to examine all these things, see what might mesh well together. So you put together a package, and I think that at Parliament, that's what you're doing there. You're putting packages together that work really, really well. And so, what are the outcomes if you do your maintenance plan or feasibility study? You can really identify priority things. This is this large winch house again, and you can see that there hasn't been an opportunity up until now to plan things. So we have large, significant termite nests. We have a rainwater pipe in the middle. That could have been attended to quite easily. And we have drains from a downpipe, which are, you can see it, so full of debris that it's plants growing out of it. A little bit of time up front might well save you significant amounts of money. And I would say a maintenance plan is the way to do that. Now, this is a building next door to the large winch house. It's a large workshop that had steel windows that were corroding furiously. And this did have the benefit of some feasibility studies, and the project started off as, oh, let's replace the windows. So we got some budgets from contractors for replacing the windows. They were absolutely horrendous. And we said, well, why don't we look at doing a little bit more than just replacing the windows? And so by looking around the building, we found all sorts of other bits and pieces. But interestingly, the windows, they had been left unpainted for so long. They were, once we took them to be sandblasted, the sandblasting was just blowing holes in them. So we tried other things. We tried walnut shell blasting. We tried all sorts of more and more gentle things, and they were falling to pieces. So we said, well, let's put back new windows. Bearing in mind, back to our environmental analysis, it's only 200 meters or a bit less from breaking surf. We put back stainless steel windows. We were able to reuse components. They have the same joints that the original windows had. And we know for this client, they have a very large portfolio. They don't have time to be running back and forward all the time repainting. This was such a big cost. The upgrade to stainless steel will save them just so much money over time, because if they're a little bit slack on the painting program, well, it's not a catastrophe. Nearly there. Sometimes on your perhaps rather unglamorous projects that we all do from time to time, in this case, we're looking at redoing the cladding, we will find some things that are less than palatable. The middle photograph, a gap between two warehouses, and running down the left-hand side at ground level is high voltage power supply that served a large portion of the port. You can't just turn it off. So this took a lot of planning, and I'm not absolutely convinced that everybody quite came to the party quite as well as they might have. The high voltage power was bolted onto the side of someone's leased building. It wasn't an easy thing. It did have a lot of planning. It got there, and I think it did manage to minimize cost variations. But it's a real example of, you know, we need to be open and we need to try and work together to reach solutions that, and that one, you just couldn't turn the power off. So it had to be worked around, and that meant we had some rather unusual flashing details where the new material could stop and the old material had to remain. This was another little building. This is the small winch room at Victoria Quay. And on this one, the works happened before things became absolutely disastrous in terms of corrosion and timber decay. And the only thing that was really difficult here was the removing the asbestos cement sheet cladding. That's the white material in the top two photographs. we thought that the new non-asbestos cement sheeting would be would look very similar. It turned out that some of the manufacturers now deliver it pre-primed, so that was a bit of an interesting rush around at the last minute, and perhaps an example where a little bit more planning by us and others, we might have had some samples of that product earlier in the piece. It wasn't a disaster, it was fixed. You get some idea here of the dealing with asbestos, you know, a little bit of planning in the bottom center picture to protect all of that equipment during the removal of asbestos was pretty important, because you can imagine once the asbestos dust gets into all the fine bits of machinery, you're never going to get it out again. So that was managed in that process. And this one had another interesting little thing of the fire pumps you see in the top left photograph in red. Those are the pumps that provide fire protection for the entire Maritime Museum complex. So they had to be maintained. Interestingly, their structure was corroding furiously, not very old, but proximity to the ocean. And again, that went back with, that had a stainless steel structure put in there and aluminium cladding. And you just have to be a bit careful of differential metal failure. But that structure will give them protection of their vital fire equipment for very much longer than a galvanized structure would. So the last slide. You're going to get urgent works. You can't plan for everything. I think the Parliament example here in the team, you know, heck, we've suddenly got a threat. You're going to get these things, hopefully not as dramatic, but as much planning as you can will help. And example I was going to give, but I think Hughes is better. I was going to say, if we have something that looks like it's collapsing, we need to get propping in quickly. We don't have to fix the problem permanently. We need to prop. Hughes' example, much the same. Let's get these bollards in. Let's buy a bit of time to think about it, and a perfect solution. Now, planned works will almost always be preferable. You know, we are still in a very, very reactive and volatile period post-COVID. If anyone thinks it's getting better, well, in the news at the weekend, the construction industry is saying with the government incentives to try and develop more affordable housing, we need 90,000 more workers. That's fantastic, but that does mean there'll be more and more pressure on people who might otherwise work on all of our heritage properties. And the impact of that is we don't always get the 80. And that's a big thing. As the quality goes down, you need to be more and more descriptive and prescriptive on what you want done to your buildings. We think if where you can spend a little bit of time doing some feasibility study or maintenance, and it will give you the best placement to move forward. Whether your project be very small or very large, it's always better to have that little bit of investigative works first. And how do you start? Well, you've got Catherine, you've got Lithia, you've got all the people at DPLH will guide you, and then you can have a vast number of different consultants. And whilst blowing the architects' trumpets, you probably find that architects are a good starting point. We're a bit like your GP. We're going to say, oh, I think you need to go and see someone about your ear or your big toe. But go to your GP first, go to your architects with the DPLH, and we'll just help you get that general picture of where to go. I hope that's been of some interest. It's not at the dramatic scale of Parliament or Dumas House or the water pipeline, but it's stuff you might encounter on a day-to-day basis. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. So that's the end of our workshop. If you've got any questions in the last couple of minutes that we've got today for any of our speakers, now's your chance. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming. So I'll open up to the floor. Is there any questions for anybody? Going. Okay, well, thank you again. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you've got something out of this this session, and we'll send you an email with some of the resources that DPLH have that might guide you in your work, as well as a bit of a feedback survey, so you can tell us how we went. So thank you very much.